Some bands fade quietly, others burn out in a blaze of noise and ego. The Beatles did something far more complicated than either. They broke apart slowly, painfully, and then somehow found the strength to leave the world with two of the greatest albums ever made, The Setup. There is a particular kind of pressure that has no real name, because nothing in ordinary human experience prepares you for it. The pressure of being the most famous people on the planet, simultaneously loved and consumed by an audience so large and so hungry that it stops feeling like admiration and starts feeling like something closer to suffocation. By 1968, the Beatles had been living inside that pressure for the better part of 6 years, and the strain was beginning to show in ways that no amount of professional polish could hide.
And from the first time that you really done me.
They had stopped touring in 1966, which was supposed to give them breathing room. Instead, it gave them more time to notice how different they had become from one another. John Lennon was restless, politically radicalized, and increasingly absorbed in his relationship with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney was driven, controlling, and desperate to keep the band moving forward with the same momentum it had always carried. George Harrison had returned from India with a spiritual depth and a songwriting confidence that the band's internal hierarchy had never fully made room for. Ringo Starr watched all of it from behind his drum kit with a patience and a decency that the history books have never quite given him enough credit for. What held them together was the music, and even that was beginning to strain under the weight of 4 increasingly divergent visions of what the music should be. The White Album, released in November 1968, was less a band album than 4 solo projects recorded in the same building. Musicians played on each other's tracks out of obligation, rather than inspiration. The breaking point. The White Album sessions have become legendary for all the wrong reasons. What should have been a creative triumph, the Beatles returning from India refreshed and loaded with new material, became instead the most uncomfortable, extended recording experience of their career.
To be free, blackbird fly.
The tensions that had been quietly building for years finally broke through the surface, and what emerged was not pretty. George Harrison quit the band for the first time during those sessions, walking out after a confrontation with Paul McCartney that had been captured on tape with a frankness that still makes listening uncomfortable decades later.
Still my guitar gently weeps.
Ringo Starr had already quit briefly the previous year during the Magical Mystery Tour sessions, returning only after the others sent flowers to his house. John Lennon was bringing Yoko Ono into the studio every single day, breaking an unspoken rule that the studio was band territory, and the presence of an outsider at the creative core of the group created a friction that nobody knew how to address directly. Paul, meanwhile, was compensating for the chaos by tightening his grip on the creative process, which only accelerated the resentment building around him. He was producing, arranging, directing, and occasionally playing other people's instruments when he felt they were not meeting his standards. His intentions were never malicious. He genuinely believed he was holding everything together, but the effect on the others, particularly on George, was corrosive. It communicated without words that their contributions were secondary, that the band existed primarily to execute Paul's vision, and that was a message none of them were willing to accept indefinitely. The wound. If the White Album sessions were damaging, the Get Back project that followed them was something closer to an autopsy. The idea was straightforward and well-intentioned. The Beatles would rehearse a new set of songs, perform them live for the first time in years, and the whole process would be filmed as a documentary that would show the world how the greatest band in history actually worked. What the cameras captured instead was something nobody had planned for, and nobody could stop once it started rolling. The sessions were held at Twickenham Film Studios in January 1969, and from the very first day, the atmosphere was wrong. The space was too large, too cold, too much like a film set, and too little like a recording studio. The cameras created a self-consciousness that made every creative stumble feel like a public failure. The band arrived each morning already carrying the accumulated weight of months of tension, and sat down to try to make music together, as if none of that weight existed. The footage that eventually became the Let It Be documentary and later the Get Back series showed arguments that were painful to watch. Paul and George clashing again, this time on camera, with George eventually walking out a second time and not returning for several days. John arrived late, or not arriving at all. His attention divided between the band and Yoko, between his past and what he was increasingly certain was his future. The conversation between John and Paul captured in the cafeteria, two old friends talking around the thing they could not quite bring themselves to say directly, remains one of the most quietly devastating documents in the history of popular music. If you are the kind of person who believes that the greatest music comes from the most unlikely places, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring these stories with us. There is so much more to come. Let us continue. The song Let It Be was not written in that cold Twickenham studio. It had been written months earlier, born from a dream that Paul McCartney had during one of the most difficult periods of his life. In that dream, his mother Mary, who had died of cancer when Paul was just 14 years old, came to him and spoke words of comfort. She told him that everything was going to be all right, that in moments of darkness and confusion, the answer was simply to let it be.
Yeah, there will be an answer, let it be.
Paul woke from that dream and went straight to the piano. The song arrived almost fully formed, which is how the best songs always seem to come, as if they were waiting somewhere just beyond conscious reach, and the dream had simply unlocked the door. The melody was gentle and hymn-like, built around a chord progression that felt ancient and familiar in the way that all truly resonant music does. The lyrics were simple to the point of being almost plain, which was precisely their power. There was nothing clever or sophisticated about them. They were just true. What made the song so extraordinary in the context of what the Beatles were going through was its emotional directness. This was not John's abstract poetry or George's philosophical searching. This was Paul McCartney, the most publicly confident and professionally driven Beatle, revealing something genuinely vulnerable about himself. The grief of losing his mother young, the need for comfort in moments of chaos, the simple human desire to believe that things would work out even when every available piece of evidence suggested otherwise. The decision. By the time the Get Back sessions limped to their conclusion, everyone involved knew that the resulting tapes were unreleasable in their current form. The performances were ragged, the atmosphere captured on film was too raw and too uncomfortable, and the whole project felt less like a triumphant return and more like a public unraveling. The tapes were handed to Phil Spector, a decision that Paul McCartney in particular would contest bitterly for years, and the project was quietly shelved while the band tried to figure out what came next. What came next was Abbey Road, and it happened because of a conversation between Paul McCartney and George Martin that cut through all the accumulated tension with a single condition. Martin agreed to produce one more Beatles album, but only if they were willing to behave like professionals. No arguments in the studio. No spouses or partners present during recording. No power struggles over who played what on whose songs. Just four musicians and their producer making the best album they possibly could. The others agreed, whether out of genuine renewed commitment or simply because they all understood on some level that this was the end and wanted to end it properly, is something that history has never quite resolved. But the agreement held, and what emerged from those sessions over the summer of 1969 was remarkable. The tension did not disappear. It never fully disappeared, but it was redirected into the music in a way that gave the album an emotional intensity that more comfortable sessions might never have produced. Come Together. If Let It Be was Paul's moment of vulnerability, Come Together was John Lennon's declaration that he was still, despite everything, operating at a level that nobody else in rock music could touch.
In his armchair you can feel his disease. Come together.
The song began as a campaign song, written at the request of Timothy Leary, who was running for governor of California against Ronald Reagan and wanted something with energy and momentum. What Lennon delivered was something far stranger and far more powerful than any campaign song had a right to be. The lyrics were deliberately surreal.
Thing I can tell you is you got to be free. Come together.
A series of vivid and disconnected character sketches that seemed to describe a single figure from multiple angles without ever fully resolving into a coherent portrait. Flat top, walrus, holy roller, toe jam football. The images piled on top of each other with a confidence that dared you to ask what they meant, knowing that the asking was the point. Come together, right now, over me. The chorus was simple enough to be a chant and ambiguous enough to mean almost anything. Musically, the song was built on a bass line that Paul McCartney later described as one of his own personal favorites among everything he had ever recorded. He has a slow rolling groove that gave the track a physical weight perfectly matched to the lyrical density above it. John's vocal was loose and conversational in the verses, then suddenly commanding in the chorus. A shift that happened so naturally, it took several listens to fully appreciate how deliberately it had been constructed. The song borrowed its opening riff from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me, which led to a plagiarism lawsuit that Lennon eventually settled by agreeing to record several songs owned by the plaintiff's publisher, the Rooftop. On January 30th, 1969, the Beatles climbed to the roof of their Apple Corps building at 3 Savile Row in London and played music together in public for the last time in their lives. Nobody in the street below knew it was coming. Nobody had been told. There were no tickets, no announcements, no carefully managed press releases. Just 4 men and their instruments appearing without warning above a London lunchtime crowd and playing as if they had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The set lasted 42 minutes. They played Get Back 3 times, trying different arrangements, treating the rooftop like a rehearsal space rather than a stage. They played Don't Let Me Down with a rawness that the studio version had never quite captured. They played I've Got a Feeling. The two halves of John and Paul's diverging visions somehow holding together for one last time. The wind was cold enough that Yoko and Linda Eastman, Paul's future wife, sat wrapped in fur coats while the band played on. The police arrived eventually, called by neighbors complaining about the noise. An officer came to the roof and asked them to stop. They played one more song before complying, which under the circumstances felt like exactly the right response. John's final words into the microphone before they packed up and went back downstairs were characteristically perfect. He thanked the band on behalf of himself and the group and hoped they had passed the audition. The crowd that had gathered in the street below cheered The Legacy. Abbey Road was released in September 1969 and debuted at #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States. The reviews were ecstatic, which felt almost beside the point given what everyone involved knew about the circumstances of its creation. Let It Be followed in May 1970, by which point the band had officially broken up, making the album's title feel less like a message of comfort and more like a quiet farewell that had been sitting there waiting to be understood. Together, the two albums preserved something about the Beatles that the chaos of their final years could easily have obscured. They preserved the fact that even at their most divided and most exhausted, these 4 people were capable of making music that nobody else on earth could have made. The songwriting, the arrangements, the performances, all of it operated at a level that their contemporaries were not reaching, and that subsequent generations have spent decades trying to understand and emulate. Let It Be in particular grew in stature over the decades, in a way that its complicated release history initially obscured. Peter Jackson's 2021 restoration of the Get Back footage recontextualized the entire period, revealing not just the tension that everyone knew about, but the joy and the humor and the genuine musical chemistry that had always existed alongside it. Watching the Beatles work through Come Together or play Let It Be for the first time in that cold Twickenham studio, you are reminded that the story of their ending is not only a story of dissolution. The Beatles could have ended quietly, bitterly, and without dignity. Instead, they climbed a rooftop, played one last time for anyone who happened to be listening, and left behind 2 albums that the world is still not done with. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us which Beatles era means the most to you. We'll see you in the next one.